The Paramount Theater in Brooklyn smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled beer, and Elvis Presley stood in a hallway backstage, trying to remember the last time he'd felt this nervous. It was November 1956. He was 21 years old. He had already appeared on national television. He had already caused scandals and sold records and heard his name screamed by thousands of girls who didn't know him but were certain they loved him. But tonight, standing in this narrow corridor with peeling paint and exposed pipes overhead, he felt like a fraud. Chuck Berry was 3 dressing rooms down the hall. Elvis knew this because he'd been listening to Berry's voice for the past 20 minutes. That distinctive baritone cutting through walls, talking to someone about chord progressions and bridge structures, with the casual authority of a man who'd invented half of what rock and roll had become. Elvis had studied every Chuck Berry record he could find. He'd learned the guitar riffs note for note. He'd absorbed the storytelling, the humor, the way Berry could make a song feel like a movie compressed into 3 minutes. But he'd never met the man. He'd never stood in the same building with him. And now that the moment had arrived, Elvis felt something he hadn't expected. Shame. Not the shame of being caught doing something wrong. The shame of succeeding at something you didn't entirely earn. The shame of being rewarded for borrowing what others had built, while those others received a fraction of the credit and none of the adulation. The Alan Freed Show was the biggest rock and roll package tour in America, a traveling circus of the genre's biggest names performing in cities across the country. Elvis had been added to the Brooklyn lineup at the last minute, a special guest appearance that the promoters hoped would sell extra tickets. Chuck Berry was the headliner, the master craftsman whose songs had defined what this music could be. But Elvis knew, everyone knew, that the crowds were coming for him, not because he was better, because he was white. He had 20 minutes before he was supposed to go on. He stood in his dressing room, really just a converted storage space, with a mirror and a folding chair, and looked at his reflection with something approaching disgust. The famous hair was perfect. The clothes were carefully chosen to project danger and sexuality in equal measure. The face looking back at him was the face that magazines had started calling the most famous in America. But all Elvis could see was a thief. A knock at the door. Yeah? Scotty Moore stuck his head in. 5 minutes. You ready? Elvis nodded. He wasn't ready. He would never be ready for what he was about to do. The plan had formed, sometime during the flight from Memphis to New York. Elvis didn't know when exactly. It had just appeared in his mind, fully formed, the way important decisions sometimes did. Not as a thought, but as a knowing. He was going to do something tonight that Colonel Parker would never approve of. Something that might damage his career. Something that felt, for the first time in months, like the right thing. He was going to introduce Chuck Berry. Not just introduce him, celebrate him. Give credit where credit was due, in front of thousands of people who needed to hear it. The backstage area was chaos. Musicians tuning instruments, technicians running cables, the smell of sweat and electricity and possibility. Elvis moved through it with his head down, trying to be invisible, which was impossible when you were Elvis Presley. People called his name. Hands reached for him. He kept walking. Chuck Berry's dressing room door was closed. Elvis stood in front of it for a long moment, his hand raised to knock, frozen in a posture of uncertainty. Behind that door was a man whose music had changed Elvis's life, a man who had written songs that Elvis had studied like scripture, trying to understand the architecture of genius, a man who had every reason to despise him. He knocked. Come in. Chuck Berry sat in a wooden chair, his guitar across his lap, wearing a suit that looked expensive but slightly worn, the kind of worn that comes from being the only good suit a man owns, worn repeatedly because he can't afford another. He was 30 years old, 9 years older than Elvis, and his face held an expression Elvis would later describe as carefully neutral, not hostile, not welcoming, just waiting. Mr. Berry, Elvis said. His voice came out smaller than intended. I'm Elvis Presley. I know who you are. The words weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were just facts, delivered in a tone that suggested Chuck Berry had no particular interest in this conversation, but was willing to endure it out of professional courtesy. Elvis stood in the doorway. He hadn't prepared for this. He'd planned what he was going to say on stage, but he hadn't thought about this moment. The actual human encounter. The meeting of two people whose lives had become entangled without their consent. I wanted to tell you something before the show, Elvis said. I wanted to tell you that your music, what you've done, it's the foundation of everything I do. Every move, every sound, it all comes from what you built. And I know I know the world doesn't see it that way, but I see it, and I wanted you to know that I see it. Chuck Berry looked at him for a long moment. His fingers moved absently across the guitar strings, not playing anything, just touching them the way a person touches something familiar when they need to ground themselves. You making good money, Elvis? The question caught him off guard. Sir? Money. You making good money off this music? Off my music? Elvis felt his face flush.
Yes, sir.
How much? I don't know exactly. My manager handles more than me? The silence stretched. Elvis wanted to lie. He wanted to make excuses. He wanted to explain the system, the industry, the way things worked. That wasn't his fault. But all he said was the truth. Yes, sir. More than you. Chuck Berry nodded slowly. He set the guitar aside and stood up. He was taller than Elvis had expected, his presence filling the small room with something that felt like controlled anger, mixed with profound exhaustion. You know what's funny about this business? Chuck Berry said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that could cut glass. I write the songs. I create the sound. I spend years perfecting the craft. And then someone who looks like you comes along and sings it, and suddenly it's acceptable. Suddenly it's not race music anymore. Suddenly white kids can listen to it without their parents losing their minds. You know what they pay me to headline this show tonight? $300. You know what they're paying you for 20 minutes? Elvis didn't answer. He didn't need to. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Chuck Berry continued. I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. Your guilt doesn't fix anything. Your appreciation doesn't pay my bills. You standing here telling me you see what I've done. That's nice. That's real nice. But it doesn't change the fact that the world looks at you and sees the future of rock and roll. And it looks at me and sees a novelty act that'll be forgotten in 5 years.
That's not true.
It is true. Chuck Berry's voice hardened slightly. And you know it's true. That's why you're standing in my dressing room right now looking like you want to apologize for existing. But here's what you don't understand, Elvis. I don't need your apology. I need the world to change. And you apologizing to me in private while you take my sound and my style and my soul out on that stage, that doesn't change anything. Elvis felt something break inside him. Not violently, quietly. The breaking of an illusion he hadn't known he was holding. The illusion that good intentions could somehow balance the scales of systemic injustice. What should I do? He asked. The question came out raw, almost childlike. Chuck Berry looked at him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been recognition. You really want to know?
Yes, sir.
Then do this. Chuck Berry moved closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. When you go out on that stage tonight, and those thousands of white kids scream your name, you tell them where this music came from. You tell them about me and Little Richard and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and every black artist who built this sound while America tried to pretend we didn't exist. You tell them in a way they can't ignore. You make them uncomfortable. You make them think, because that's the only power you have that I don't. They'll listen to you. Use it. Elvis nodded. His throat was tight. And one more thing, Chuck Berry said. Stop trying to be me. Be you. Take what you learned and make it your own. Because the worst thing you could do, worse than taking credit, worse than making money, would be to waste the opportunity. You've been given a platform I'll never have. Use it to make something that matters. Don't just be a copy. Be original. That's how you honor what I've done. The call came from somewhere in the hallway. 5 minutes to showtime. Elvis stood in Chuck Berry's dressing room, younger and whiter and luckier than the man who had built the foundation of his career. And he felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. But he also felt something else. Clarity. Purpose. The sense that he'd been given a gift that looked like criticism but was actually wisdom. Thank you, Elvis said quietly. Chuck Berry extended his hand. Elvis took it. The handshake was firm, brief, professional. Two musicians, acknowledging each other, without pretending the world between them was fair. The Paramount Theater held 3,000 people, and every seat was filled. Elvis stood in the wings, listening to the roar of anticipation, and he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. When the announcer called his name, when the spotlight found him, and the screaming began, Elvis walked to the microphone and did something he'd never done before. He stopped. He stood in silence. He let the noise die down naturally rather than feeding into it. And when the theater was finally quiet enough to hear a whisper, he spoke. "Before I sing anything tonight," Elvis said, "I need to tell you about a man who's down the hall in a dressing room right now. His name is Chuck Berry, and if you've ever heard me play a guitar or sing a rock and roll song, you're really hearing him, because he invented this. Not me, him." The audience stirred. This wasn't what they'd come for. He wrote Maybelline and Roll Over Beethoven, and Johnny Be Good. Well, he will write that one eventually. Elvis allowed himself a small smile at the anachronism, and he did it better than anyone. But here's what you need to know. The reason I'm standing on this stage and he's waiting in the wings, the reason I'm the one your parents approve of and he's the one they call dangerous, has nothing to do with talent. It has everything to do with the color of my skin versus the color of his. The theater was absolutely silent now. Elvis could see faces in the front rows. Confusion, discomfort, curiosity. "So I'm going to do something tonight," Elvis continued. "I'm going to play one of his songs, and I'm not going to do it the way I usually do it. I'm going to do it the way he did it, because you deserve to hear it the right way. And when I'm done, Chuck Berry is going to come out here, and you're going to give him the biggest applause this theater has ever heard. Not because I'm asking you to, because he earned it." He picked up a guitar. His hands were shaking slightly. The band behind him looked uncertain. This wasn't in the set list, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't anything they'd prepared for. Elvis played Maybelline, not his version, Chuck Berry's version. He played it with the precision and respect of someone performing a standard, acknowledging every lick, every vocal inflection, every choice that Berry had made when he created the song. He stripped away his own style and let Berry's genius speak for itself. When the song ended, the applause was confused, good, but uncertain. The audience not quite understanding what they just witnessed. Elvis set down the guitar and walked to the side of the stage. He extended his hand toward the wings. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chuck Berry." Chuck Berry walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was polite, respectful, nothing like the mania that had erupted for Elvis. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. And as Chuck Berry stood at the microphone, guitar in hand, looking out at 3,000 mostly white faces in Brooklyn, New York, something in his expression shifted. He played Roll Over Beethoven. The theater, already energized by Elvis's appearance, erupted. People stood, they danced, they screamed, and for those 4 minutes, Chuck Berry was exactly what he deserved to be. The star, the creator, the genius who had built something from nothing. When the song ended, when Chuck Berry took his bow and walked off stage, he passed Elvis in the wings. Their eyes met. Chuck Berry nodded once, a small gesture, almost invisible, but weighted with meaning. Elvis didn't perform that night. He'd used his entire 20-minute slot to honor Chuck Berry, and there was no time left for his own songs. Colonel Parker was furious. The promoters threatened to withhold payment. Reviews the next day called it bizarre and self-sabotaging. But something had changed. In the dressing room, after the show, after the crowds had dispersed and the theater had emptied, Chuck Berry appeared at Elvis's door. He didn't knock. He just stood there, waiting. Elvis looked up. "Mr. Berry." "Chuck." "Chuck." Chuck Berry walked into the room and sat down in the folding chair. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Chuck Berry said something that Elvis would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You could have taken the easy path tonight. You could have done your show, collected your money, gone home feeling good about yourself because you said some nice words in a dressing room where nobody could hear them. But you didn't. You put something at risk. You made people uncomfortable. You used your platform in a way that might actually change how some of them think. That takes courage, real courage. Elvis felt tears prick at his eyes. It's not enough. It doesn't fix anything. No, Chuck Berry agreed. It doesn't fix anything, but it's a start. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Start. And then keep starting. Every day, until the world catches up to where it should have been all along. They talked for another hour. Not about music, or fame, or any of the things that separated them. They talked about growing up poor. Chuck in St. Louis, Elvis in Tupelo. They talked about the first time they'd felt music change something inside them. They talked about mothers and fathers, and the particular weight of being looked at by people who wanted you to be a symbol rather than a person. When Chuck Berry finally stood to leave, he put his hand on Elvis's shoulder. Keep doing what you did tonight. Not every night, you've got to take care of your career too. But as often as you can, tell the truth. Give credit. Make them uncomfortable. That's how things change. One uncomfortable moment at a time. Elvis nodded. Will I see you again? Probably not, Chuck Berry said honestly. We're traveling different roads, but you'll carry what happened tonight with you, and I'll carry it too. That's enough. In the years that followed, Elvis did something unusual for a performer of his stature. He made it a habit, whenever interviewed, to mention Chuck Berry by name, to cite him as an influence, to push back against journalists who tried to credit Elvis with inventing rock and roll. Some interviews printed it, many didn't, but he kept doing it anyway. Chuck Berry, for his part, softened slightly in his public statements about Elvis. Never warm. The injustice was too great for warmth, but respectful. In a 1972 interview, when asked about white artists performing rock and roll, Chuck Berry said, Elvis Presley understood something most of them didn't. He understood where it came from. He didn't pretend. That's worth something. When Elvis died in August 1977, Chuck Berry was asked for a comment. His response was brief. He was better than most of them. He listened. He tried. Years later, in one of his final interviews before his own death in 2017, Chuck Berry spoke about that night in Brooklyn. The interviewer had found a reference to it in old Paramount theater records, a notation that Elvis Presley had used his entire performance slot to introduce Chuck Berry and had not performed his own material. Did that really happen? The interviewer asked. Chuck Berry, 90 years old, sitting in his home in Missouri, smiled slightly. It happened. And you know what? It mattered. Not because it changed the industry, not because it made things fair, but because for one night, a kid with everything to lose put his career at risk to tell the truth. That's rare. That deserves to be remembered. The interviewer pressed. Did it change your relationship with Elvis? Chuck Berry considered the question. We weren't friends. We couldn't be friends. The world wouldn't allow it. But we had respect. Real respect. The kind that comes from one artist recognizing another artist, and one human being recognizing another human being. In this business, that's about as close to friendship as people like us could get. That's the story. Not of friendship. Not of redemption. Not of a single moment fixing systemic injustice. Just the story of two men who met in a hallway, acknowledged the unfairness of the world they inhabited, and found a way to honor each other despite it. Chuck Berry built rock and roll. Elvis Presley carried it to places Chuck Berry could never reach. The injustice of that fact doesn't disappear. But for one night in Brooklyn, in a theater filled with people who needed to hear the truth, Elvis Presley made a choice that cost him something. He told the truth. He gave credit. He made people uncomfortable. And in doing so, he honored not just Chuck Berry, but every black artist who had built the foundation he stood on. That's not redemption. That's not enough. But it's something. And sometimes, in a world built on injustice, something is all we can offer. The question is, will we offer it?